Lonely rancher bought a deaf girl for $1. What he discovered next changed everything. Before we begin, comment your country so I know where the story is reaching. The dust of late autumn hung over the county fairgrounds like an old curtain, soft enough to dull sound, but heavy enough to make a man feel the weight of it in his chest. Folks talked low, horses shuffled, and the auctioneer's voice cracked through the stillness as if even he was tired of hearing himself. Jed Malden hadn't planned on coming. He rarely left his valley anymore, not since age had begun to settle into his bones and the ranch had grown too quiet. But a storm earlier that week had taken down a fence line, and he needed timber and one serviceable pack horse to haul it. Nothing more. He walked past the wagons and barrels without hurrying, eyes fixed on the livestock pens, until he saw a small crowd gathered near the old loading ramp. The mood wasn't lively, not mocking, not cruel. It was uncomfortable. People shifting their boots, chewing their lips, pretending they weren't looking. At the center of it stood a girl, thin, barefoot, dress hanging weary around her frame. A trader held a rope loosely tied to her wrist, as if she were no different from the mule tethered behind him. Her hair fell in soft tangles, face pale from too much sun and not enough sleep. But what caught Jed wasn't her silence. It was the way she didn't shrink from anyone. She simply stood still, as if she'd already survived the worst a person could hand her. "She can't hear a word," the trader announced. "Don't speak, neither. But she works, sweeps, cooks. Don't cause trouble." His tone carried the dullness of a man trying to move merchandise, not a human being. A few men chuckled uneasily. Nobody bid. Jed started to walk on. He wanted nothing to do with a situation that smelled like another man's shame. But then the girl lifted her gaze toward him, not pleading, not frightened. Just steady, present, as if she recognized something familiar, before he even knew what it was. The trader wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Take her and the pack horse both. $1 for the pair. I'm tired of traveling with things that don't earn their keep." The words tasted rotten. But the girl's eyes stayed calm, unblinking, almost collected in a way that made the rest of the world feel noisy and small. Jed felt his hand move before his thoughts caught up. He pulled a single silver coin from his coat and set it into the trader's palm. No one laughed this time. They just stared, uncertain whether to pity him or admire him. He didn't wait for permission. He loosened the rope gently from her wrist, let it drop, and motioned toward his wagon with a quiet tilt of his head. She followed, not behind him like a servant, but beside him, as though that had been the arrangement all along. The wagon creaked out of the fairgrounds and into open country. Wind brushed over the dry grass, carrying the distant smell of rain that might not come. The girl sat in the back wrapped in an old canvas blanket, her chin lifted just enough to watch the changing shapes of hills. Jed wasn't a man who filled silence. He simply drove, letting the rhythm of the road settle the dust inside him. Yet every so often, he glanced back and found her watching the land with something like concentration, as though each ridge and shadow meant more than he could guess. At the ranch, dusk spread across the valley in long gold strokes. Jed offered her water and a plate of bread and stew. She accepted with a nod, careful, composed. Still not a sound from her lips. He cleared a small space near the hearth for her to sleep, laid out a quilt his late wife had stitched decades earlier, and stepped back to breathe. The room felt different with another heartbeat inside it. Unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. Before lying down, she touched his sleeve lightly, just once, as if to say she understood something without needing words. He didn't sleep much, not from worry, but from wondering why she had looked at him the way she had, and how a single silver coin could feel heavier than any debt he'd ever carried. Morning came pale and quiet. The sun rolled over the ridge with slow confidence. Jed pushed open the barn door, saddled the mare, and froze. The girl was already there. She stood beside the old pack horse, stroking its neck in gentle circles. The animal, usually tense with strangers, rested its head against her shoulder as if it had known her longer than a breath. Jed watched in silence. She hadn't heard him enter, yet after a moment, she turned, meeting his eyes with the same soft steadiness she'd shown at the fairgrounds. She pointed to the horse's cracked hoof, then to the bucket of liniment on the shelf, not asking permission, showing she understood what needed doing. Somehow she had woken before him, found her way to the barn, and chosen to help. He nodded slowly. Something settled in his chest, not heavy, but certain. This girl, bought for $1, carried knowledge he didn't yet understand, and he could feel, deep as the valley floor, that her presence was going to change far more than his quiet ranch. The valley held its breath as the weeks turned. Snow thawed into mud, mud to dust, and life returned in small, stubborn increments. Jed watched the girl move through the ranch as if she'd always belonged to place, mending a torn harness with careful fingers, humming in a way that shivered more in the ribs than the air, leading the mare with a confidence that suggested more than practice. He still did not ask her name. She had written it on the doorframe with a stub of chalk the first night, and Jed found himself tracing those letters more than once when the wind came in hard. Word moved slower in the county than Jed expected. News that a stranger stayed at his place reached the town and returned with the kind of stories that made a man fold his mouth shut. Some called her miracle worker. Others said she meddled with things better left alone. A few claimed she had an odd way of knowing what was coming, as if she listened to the land and found answers in the way grass bowed or the sky held color. Jed paid little mind to gossip. He had fences to mend and land to tend. Yet the ranch settled different with her there. Even the animals changed. Horses that had been skittish grew patient in her presence. The barn cats trusted her enough to sleep at the foot of her chair. There was an unspoken order to it, a rhythm Jed had spent years trying to shape with hard hands and harder patience. She fit into the rhythm like a missing note that turned the song right. One morning in late spring, a messenger arrived from town with a note clenched between teeth. The sheriff wanted Jed at the meeting hall. A child was missing. The town was rattled. Jed dusted his coat without much thought and found the girl sitting on the porch, heels tucked, eyes on the road. She didn't rise when he left. She only placed a small cloth-wrapped packet into his palm, smelling of lavender and something woodsy, and gave him a look that asked him to come back soon. At the town meeting, neighbors argued in low, urgent tones while the sun sat like a coin behind the bell tower. Jed listened more than he spoke, because listening required less swallowing and more attention. They organized search parties that spread out like slow fingers when a hand needs something. Jed saddled up with 3 others and found himself riding toward the thinning line of trees on the western ridge. The wind cut through his coat. Branches tapped the horse's flanks like light fists. Farther in, the trees gathered like an audience. The men split, voices shrinking into the tree lean, and Jed listened for the sound of children or the snap of a small branch underfoot. Nothing came. Then, from a direction he hadn't expected, the girl stepped out of the trees, as if she'd been there the whole time. No footprints leading to her, no sound, only presence. She did not call out. She pressed a palm to ground near a mossy root, eyes narrowing the way a reader leans into a page. Then she pointed, not to the left or the right, but toward a narrow hollow where the underbrush lay thicker. Jed moved to follow and found a small boot snagged on a briar, a sleeve stuck in a creeping vine. The boy curled close and shaking but alive beneath a low thorn bush. He'd slipped, lost his way, and slept to keep warm. The men breathed out like they'd been holding their own breaths for days. After that day, the notion that the girl heard with more than ears became less superstition and more fact in the town's quiet corners. People who had once crossed the road to avoid her now came with questions tucked under their arms. how to soothe a fever, what to do when a mare refused to eat, how to mend a child's broken toy. She refused payment, accepting instead a smile or a tin of preserves, small tokens that smelled like summer. Jed found himself watching her more than tending the fences. He learned the slow way she had of counting a herd. Not numbers, but patterns, a tilt of an ear, the way a tail flicked. She taught children without words. She taught them patience and how to let a horse show you when it was ready to trust. The children learned quickly and stayed close in a way that made Jed think of birds returning to a branch. As the year rounded into a warm, clear autumn, Jed faced a crossroad he had not expected. His only living kin, a nephew in the next county, wrote asking Jed to consider selling a strip of land to cover a debt. Jed sat by the window and looked at the distant ridge where the light gathered like kettle steam. The document could mean extra hands, perhaps comfort in the future, things Jed had thought he'd long set aside. He puzzled over numbers with a mind that wanted to calculate safety like a ledger. One evening, the girl placed a hand on his arm and pointed toward the chest where the papers lay. She didn't touch them, only nudged him with her eyes, steady as a plumb line. He felt foolish to need her prompt, but the truth was he did. He had built his life around a shape of loneliness that had become familiar. Change felt like thin ice. He made a choice that felt audacious. He refused to sell the land. He told the nephew gently that the ranch belonged not to one ledger, but to a promise he could not quantify. The nephew took the news with the kind of disappointment that anger sometimes disguises, but he left with fewer words and more understanding than Jed expected. The moment Jed decided to hold on to land, something shifted subtle but profound. He awoke one morning to find seedlings pressed into a row along the fence where there had been nothing the night before, beans and corn, young and hopeful. A neighbor had come by in the night, left the starts, and moved on. The gesture felt like an answer to a prayer Jed hadn't spoken aloud. He understood then that the ranch was not merely soil and fence. It was a small stage where kindness met need, and sometimes the world returned that kindness like change from a pocket. One quiet dusk, while the light untied itself from the hills and the horses came in to stand like sentries, the girl sat at his side and wrote a single word on the slate by the door in her careful letters. It meant nothing to anyone who read it, and everything to the two who shared the house. Jed traced the strokes with a fingertip and felt the line of his life shift, not loudly, but with steady gravity. He did not ask her to speak aloud what she had given him. She did not need to. They lived in a language of small exchanges. A cup of tea left by the bed, a mended glove on the mantel, a hand held when storms moved like old memories across the plains. Late one night, Jed woke to the soft sound of someone standing in the doorway. He saw the silhouette and knew before his mind finished naming it. She stood there with a small package of dried lavender and a strip of cloth, and when she reached out, he took her hand as if he had always been holding it. In the hush, before words could pile up and complicate things, Jed understood that his life, once a measured ledger of seasons and work, had opened to something steadier and kinder. There were still questions to answer, about town, about how the world would see them. But in the amber room of their home, with the stove ticking out warmth and the horses breathing like slow clocks beyond the window, a quiet certainty settled. The ranch was no longer an island of solitude. It had become a place where two people kept time together. Autumn deepened into a gentler season that year, the kind where the wind didn't bite, but simply reminded a man to appreciate the warmth he had. Jed moved slower these days, not from age alone, but because he'd begun noticing the small details he used to rush past, the way the cottonwoods shimmered at noon, how the creek carved its path with quiet patience, how the house felt different when another pair of footsteps filled it. The girl, Mira, as the chalk letters first revealed, grew into the rhythm of the ranch without disturbing its simplicity. She tended animals with a calm that made them settle, organized shelves Jed hadn't opened in years, and left single sprigs of dried herbs above the doorframe, Small acts of care that soften the walls of the home. For the first time in his life, Jed caught himself preparing meals with 2 plates in mind instead of 1. He didn't say it aloud. Words had a way of making delicate things feel heavy. Town visits became rare, but not avoided. Folks still whispered, but the tone had shifted. Instead of suspicion, there was an uneasy curiosity. Like people wanted to believe there was something unusual about Mira, but couldn't find anything wrong enough to justify their doubts. Children stopped her on the boardwalk, offering her small found treasures. Smooth stones, feathers, a tin button from a lost coat. She accepted each with a soft nod, keeping them in a wooden bowl near the hearth. One afternoon, Jed was repairing an old gate when he noticed Mira standing in the pasture, her braid tossed lightly in the breeze. She wasn't working. She was watching the sky with the absorbed expression of someone listening inward. The moment held a kind of suspended quiet, and Jed felt a tug he couldn't name. That evening, she placed a folded slip of paper on the table. Her handwriting was careful and simple. "Walk with me when the sun is low." He didn't need to read it twice. They walked to the lower meadow, where the grass grew wiry but stubborn and the fading light turned the earth warm. Mira paused beside a flat stone near the creek, brushed off the surface, and knelt. Beneath a thin layer of dirt lay a small carved wooden figure, an old keepsake Jed had lost years earlier, made by his father when Jed was no more than 10. He hadn't told anyone about it, hadn't looked for it, hadn't even remembered where he last held it. Mira placed the figure in his hands with a quiet certainty, as if she understood the weight of memory and how much gentleness it required. Jed felt his throat tighten. How did you know? But he stopped. Asking ruined things sometimes. He didn't want to put a pin through the moment, like something to be labeled and explained. Mira didn't answer anyway. She rested her hand on his forearm and guided him back toward the house, her steps small but steady. Over the next weeks, Jed noticed how she moved through the world with an awareness that seemed deeper than sight or sound. She knew when the mare grew restless before the animal even stamped the ground. She sensed approaching guests long before their wagon wheels crackled on the road. She knew when Jed's old injury in his shoulder would flare, and she'd quietly steep a warm tonic before he admitted the pain. But what startled him most was how she understood him without being told. How she seemed to notice when he grew lost in thought, and would hand him a cup of tea before he even realized he needed company. One night, a cold spell swept through the valley earlier than expected. Jed went to bring in the lanterns and found Mira sitting on the porch step, blanket around her shoulders, watching the outline of the hills. She looked peaceful but distant, as though caught between the present moment and something older, something unnamed. He sat beside her, the board slightly groaning under his weight. "You all right?" She didn't respond right away. Instead, she reached for his hand and guided it to her chest, right over the steady rise and fall of her breath. Her gaze met his, and for the first time, he saw something like vulnerability shift beneath her calm exterior. She placed a fingertip on her throat, then drew the same finger across her heart. A gesture of confession. Jed swallowed. "You don't ever have to explain what you carry," he said gently. "I'm not here to weigh it, just to walk beside it." Her hand tightened around his, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. A closeness formed between them that didn't need to be spoken or defined. It was simply there, steady and warm. As winter approached, townsfolk began visiting the ranch more often, not out of fear, but need. A widow brought a child with a cough that wouldn't pass. A ranch hand asked if Mira could look at a calf that refused to stand. Mira helped each one quietly, using nothing more than observation, herbs, and presence. And people left with a strange mixture of relief and humility, as if they had been given something they didn't fully understand. Jed watched it unfold with a growing conviction that what she offered wasn't magic or mystery. It was compassion shaped into skill. A rare thing and a needed one. One evening, As the fire settled into soft embers, Jed looked across the table and knew with sharp clarity that he no longer wanted to imagine days without her. But the feeling wasn't desperate. It was patient, something earned through shared work and small kindnesses. Mira lifted her gaze as if she had heard his thought. She touched her palm to his cheek, warm and steady, then drew him forward until their foreheads touched. The moment was simple. The feeling was not. Outside, the wind pushed gently against the windows, not threatening but reminding them winter was coming. Yet for the first time in many years, Jed felt ready for it. He wasn't alone, and neither was she. Winter settled across the valley with a softness that surprised Jed. Snow layered the ranch in pale sheets, smoothing out every rough edge and turning the familiar pasture into something quiet and new. He and Mira fell into a steady rhythm, caring for the animal before dawn, sharing simple meals, tending the fire until the nights no longer felt long. The world beyond their land grew gentler, too. Folks who once watched Mira with unease now approached with respect. They didn't ask how she understood things the way she did. They simply trusted. A man who had lost half his herd to early frost came seeking her advice. A family whose cabin leaked cold air asked if she'd walk it, sensing she'd know where repairs mattered most. Mira offered help without fanfare, moving through the world with the same quiet certainty that had first caught Jed's breath. One afternoon, when the snow softened under a brief brush of sun, Jed and Mira walked the ridge line above the creek. He moved carefully on the incline, and she walked a step ahead, pausing now and then to make sure he followed steady. At the top, they rested on an old stump. The land stretched out beneath them. Fields, fences, creek beds, hills rolling in slow waves. This place, Jed began, unsure how to finish. Mira touched his hand gently and nodded toward the distant barn. Her eyes said she understood before he did. This wasn't just where he lived. It had become the place where his life unfolded in new shape, softened in ways he didn't know he was allowed to feel. They stayed until the sky dimmed to silver. As they rose to leave, Mira stopped and pointed to a cluster of oak saplings growing not 10 yards from them, pushing through frost with stubborn green tips. Jed blinked. There had been no saplings there the year before. He looked at her, and she looked back with a small, knowing smile, as if she'd seen the promised long before the earth revealed it. In early spring, the ground thawed enough for repairs, and neighbors arrived offering tools and extra hands. They claimed Jed had done plenty for the valley over the years, which wasn't exactly true. He had kept himself more than he ought. But people remembered things in ways that didn't always make sense. Maybe they weren't repaying him. Maybe they were repaying the gentleness Mira had shown without asking. During one of those afternoons, a young mother stepped onto the porch carrying a newborn wrapped in a patchwork quilt. Mira held the baby with reverence, tracing a careful fingertip along the child's small palm. Jed watched, something warm blooming in his chest. For the first time, he imagined a future that stretched long and full, a life not measured by silence, but shared presence. That night, with the house lit only by the slow glow of embers, he sat across from Mira at the table. She had a habit of cutting her apples into thin slices, arranging them in small spirals before eating one at a time. The ritual comforted him. It made the room feel alive. "Mira," he said, speaking her name as though it were the first word of a prayer. She looked up, patient as always. He reached into his pocket and placed a folded strip of leather on the table, worn, softened, but carefully shaped into a loop. A simple ring he had stitched himself, because he believed the first gesture he offered her should be made by his own hands. Her breath caught softly. She touched the ring, then placed it in his palm, curling his fingers around it. She stepped closer, rested her forehead lightly against his, and pressed her hand over his heart. She did not need to speak. Her answer lived in the way she held him. From that day forward, the ranch didn't just feel like a home. It felt like a continuation. something that moved beyond the old boundaries of solitude and slipped gently into shared time. They built small rituals: tea before sunrise, walking the horses at dusk, leaving a lamp burning on the porch when one of them was late returning from pasture. Mira hung a string of dried herbs above the doorway. Lavender for calm, thyme for courage, sage for protection. Jed didn't know the meanings at first, but Mira taught him one quiet evening, guiding his hands to each bundle. People said the ranch changed under their care. Animals healed quicker. The land felt lighter. A calmness settled over visitors before they stepped back onto the road. No one claimed to understand why. They didn't need to. For Jed, the miracle wasn't in explanations. It was in company, in the way Mira shaped her life into the spaces where loneliness once lived. Years passed softly. Myra's hair darkened, then lightened again at the tips under summer sun. Jed's back bent slightly, though his eyes stayed sharp. They lived in seasons, not in years. One late autumn evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Mira took his hand and led him outside. The air smelled of earth and wood smoke. She walked him to the porch rail and pointed toward the pasture, where a mare grazed with her foal. The fields glowed in the last sweep of gold, and the creek mirrored the light in slow ripples. She turned to him, eyes warm, steady as ever, and placed her hand against his cheek. Not a question, a recognition. Jed wrapped his arms around her, and they stood together, the wind moving gently around them like a blessing murmured by the land itself. Their story didn't end in noise or spectacle. It settled the way all lasting things do, quietly, faithfully, becoming part of the valley's memory. A ranch once built on loneliness had grown into a home shaped by two hearts that didn't need sound to understand each other. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment the word Valley to let me know you want the next chapter in this world of stories.